We have to confront the reality that today many women watch their babies die of preventable diseases, see their own lives cut short, for instance, by HIV or war, while education is denied their daughters. Now, I was part of a very important program all those years ago when I was responsible for the status of women in Australia, the so-called Beijing Platform for Action, which was designed to address many of these problems. So it's a bit depressing to go back after so many years and discover that so much is yet to be done. Well, not to discover, but to remind myself. And the Beijing Platform was designed to address a lot of these problems. It was an honourable attempt, and I think it still remains a relevant guideline for development programming. It was an agenda for women's empowerment, and it was said at the time, a necessary and fundamental prerequisite for equality, development and peace. And it still provides the blueprint, in my view, that we need. The important thing about that, apart from the fact that it set out a clear program for action, was that many governments signed up to it, indeed all of those who attended. There was some quibbling, particularly about sexual reproduction and rights, but by and large most governments signed up. And it did reaffirm that the human rights of women and the girl child in particular are inalienable, integral and indivisible as parts of human rights. You can't carve them up and say, well, thus far and no further. The full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by women and girls was noted down as being essential, and that at the time seemed like a breakthrough. And I do notice the importance that's been reinforced in the Millennium Development Goals of many of the same objectives. But I think we have to confront the reality, and the evidence I've given you is there, that there are severe practical issues and challenges and constraints facing government and NGOs when they try to address some of these problems. And it's fair to say that a lot of the world's leading donors, whether they be governments or NGOs, acknowledge that their gender equality policies have not translated into the actions that really do make a difference on the ground. That we haven't seen nearly as much progress in gender equality and the protection of human rights. Now, I guess there are a couple of tools available to us, and I'm sure we'll discuss those later. But in my reading, in preparing for this, I discovered that people still talk a lot about conditional aid as a potential tool, that aid should be made conditional on the achievement of various social and human rights objectives. And there are a lot of people who care about human rights who will tell you that. If a government doesn't shape up and is treating its citizens badly, then we should make aid conditional upon them meeting those objectives. And aid agreements are, in any case, typically set out in terms of conditions of both sides, the parties who receive and the donors, to give a certain level of support in exchange for undertakings that are given. We know that on both sides, those undertakings are often not met. They do cover a range of policy approaches, and they're expected in general to raise the standards of living of the poor. That's usually the typical objective. And they have included economic, environmental or social policies, including things like improved access to education for girls, for instance. And if a country presumably fails to develop the agreed conditions, then donors may reduce or even stop their support. But that, as you know, rarely happens, not least because the people who suffer most are those you're trying to assist. And views still differ widely across the international community about the right approach to aid relationships. Some advocate abandoning conditionality, as it's called, altogether, or removing conditions on particular areas of reform. So it has a pretty bad reputation because it was often enforced by the World Bank and the IMF, and they were about economic reforms rather than human rights. But others have said, while that may have failed, we should place tougher conditions, particularly in relation to corruption, the environment, trafficking, human rights and things of that kind. But I guess we have to ask ourselves before we proceed down that route whether indeed it would have the desired effect. There's no good evidence that it actually does help. It's important, obviously, to enter into agreements, and most aid programs come with what's called embedded conditionality. We don't realise it, but when we go into a community with an aid program, we've already told them what we think is important. And that's probably not a bad moment at which to say we think the rights of women and children are important. Those embedded values should include the elimination of discrimination against women, which can be seen as a universal right, as the Beijing Declaration clearly indicated. And it's probably not unreasonable to demonstrate that donors who refuse to provide aid for local systems that educate only boys are actually trying to inculcate a new set of values, to be unashamed about that. But to take it a step further, as the European Union has done to some extent, and punish nations who fail to meet human rights standards can be a double-edged sword. So-called negative conditionality, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, really only became part of the landscape, I understand, in the 1990s, when the Dutch decided to suspend a part of its aid program to Indonesia in response to the execution of 4 political prisoners who'd been bodyguards to President Sukarno. They suspended their aid, and a little while later, the government stopped executing prisoners. And then later, after the events in East Timor, several other nations did it as well. There was a pretty savage response from the Indonesian government. And Netherlands and Indonesia quietly mended fences, and the old relationship resumed. I'm not entirely sure why. But an important precedent had been set, and the EU, as I've indicated now, has given formal expression to this idea of conditionality, negative consequences, in its aid relationships with various African, Caribbean and Pacific recipients. So we have examples here. Agreement in which respect for human rights, democratic principles and the rule of law are essential elements. They do it in some of their trade policies as well. And they've adopted a policy of including democracy clauses in various bilateral agreements, making democracy and human rights part of the dialogue. More pointedly, they sometimes cut off aid. Just how successful this program has been is not clear. But the explication of those goals, I think, is very important and something that we too should work on. These programs seem to work best when they are a partnership, and I think we can argue that successful aid relationships should be based on mutual commitment and dialogue, transparency and accountability, at least where that's possible. Thank you very much.